Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. My older sister was kidnapped by a man she met online, and he trafficked her. Even writing that sentence still feels unreal, like it shouldn't belong to my life or my family, but it does. It's one of those things that permanently splits your world into before and after. At first, nothing seemed obviously wrong. She told us she was going to visit a friend in Las Vegas, someone we knew about, someone who sounded safe enough. People travel. People lie a little to avoid questions. None of us immediately thought danger. That's the part that hurts to think about now, how normal it all seemed in the beginning. After a few days turned into weeks, we started getting uneasy. We tried calling her, texting her, reaching out on social media. Nothing. No responses. No, I'm busy. No excuses. Just silence. That kind of silence is different. You can feel it in your gut when something isn't right, even if you don't want to admit it yet. Eventually, she managed to get a message out to her best friend. It was an SOS. She said she was scared. She said she didn't want to die. She sent her general location, not an exact address, just enough to give a rough idea of where she was. Then she went offline again. No explanation, no follow-up, just that message hanging there, terrifying and unfinished. That's when everything exploded. We reported her missing immediately. We contacted the Las Vegas Police Department, desperate for help, hoping someone would take control of the situation and do something. Instead, it felt like we were hitting a wall over and over again. The response was cold, dismissive, and painfully slow. I understand, logically, that police departments are overwhelmed and understaffed, that not every case gets the attention it deserves. But when it's your sister, when you know she's in danger right now, that understanding doesn't mean much. The officer we dealt with mostly just called us, asking repetitive questions, pestering us for details we'd already given, without actually doing anything that felt like action. No urgency, no sense that time mattered. It was infuriating and terrifying at the same time. We felt completely powerless, like we were screaming into a void while the clock kept ticking. Then somehow she managed to get access to a phone again. She called my mom. Hearing her voice after all that silence was overwhelming. Relief and terror collided all at once. She told my mom what had been happening, that the man she met online had taken her and was trafficking her, that she wasn't safe, that she didn't know what to do. My mom did everything she could to keep her calm, to keep her talking, to make a plan without alerting the man who had control over her. The only reason she got out is because the guy trafficking her was careless. He would take her out at night, thinking he had broken her enough that she wouldn't try to escape. One night, she saw an opportunity and took it. She ran. She didn't stop to think about where she was going or what might happen next. She just ran until she found a security guard and begged for help. One of my cousins rushed to get her. My mom met them, and together they brought her home. Just like that, she was back. Physically, at least, but nothing was the same. The relief of having her alive and back with us was immense, but it was tangled up with anger, grief, and heartbreak. What she went through didn't end the moment she escaped. Trauma doesn't work like that. It stays in your body. It shows up in nightmares, in sudden panic, in moments where your brain drags you back without warning. As a family, we were shaken to our core. There's a special kind of rage that comes from knowing someone hurt the person you love in ways you can't undo. And there's a deep frustration in knowing how close we came to losing her because of lies, manipulation, and a system that didn't move fast enough when it mattered most. What haunts me the most is how easily it happened. She met someone online. She trusted him. He lied. He trapped her. And for a while, he almost got away with it. If she hadn't gotten that message out, if she hadn't found the courage and timing to run, if that security guard hadn't been there, if my cousin hadn't answered the phone, any one of those things going differently could have ended this story in the worst possible way. I think about that a lot. I think about how many people don't get out, how many SOS messages never get sent, how many families are still waiting for a call that never comes. And I think about how close we were to being one of them. She survived, and I am endlessly grateful for that. But survival doesn't erase what happened. It just means you live with it, learn to carry it, and try to rebuild something resembling normal life afterward. This isn't a story with a clean ending. It's messy and painful and real. But it's also a reminder of how important it is to take silence seriously, to trust your gut, and to never assume something can't happen just because you don't want it to. We were lucky, and knowing how easily that luck could have run out is something I'll carry with me forever. Near my grandparents' house, there was an old airport-like area that most people in the town barely thought about anymore. It sat quietly on the edge of the landscape, wide and flat, with long stretches of cracked concrete and weathered buildings that looked like they had been forgotten by time. When my grandparents were younger, and even before that, the place had a very different purpose. During the Cold War, it had been used by the military. Planes came and went from there, serious-looking aircraft built for war, surveillance, and training. Back then, the area was active, guarded, and important. It was the kind of place that felt heavy with purpose, even if you didn't fully understand what was happening there. After the Cold War ended, everything changed. The military no longer needed the site, and eventually it was turned into a museum. The planes that once flew missions were left there as displays. They were parked in neat rows or tucked inside hangars, cleaned up just enough to be safe for the public to walk around. For the town, it became something to be proud of. It wasn't just an old base anymore, it was history. Families would visit, school groups would come through on field trips. Older people would walk slowly past the planes and talk about where they were when those aircraft were still active. At some point, the museum started doing a yearly plane show. It became a big event, especially for a small town. Once a year, people would gather at the site to watch demonstrations, see restored aircraft, and get closer to the machines than they normally could. There were food stands, families with lawn chairs, kids running around with wide eyes, staring up at the massive planes. For a lot of people, it was exciting. For kids especially, it felt like stepping into a movie or a history book that had suddenly come to life. My grandparents remembered those shows clearly. They said people came from nearby towns, sometimes even farther away. It wasn't just locals. It felt like something special, something that broke the routine of everyday life. Planes would be opened up so visitors could look inside. Volunteers and staff would explain how things worked, pointing out controls and instruments. The mood was relaxed, almost festive. There was a sense of trust, like nothing bad could happen in a place that was meant to preserve history and bring people together. One year, probably in the early 1990s, the museum held what would become the last plane show they ever did. On that day, everything seemed normal at first. Families arrived early, kids tugging at their parents' hands, excited to see the planes up close. The weather was good, the kind of day where the sky feels wide and open. People walked around freely, taking pictures, talking, laughing. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that something terrible was about to happen. At some point during the event, a little girl was allowed to sit inside one of the planes. It was meant to be a harmless, even sweet moment. The adults wanted her to have a cool memory, something she could look back on, or at least something her family could remember for her. She was very young, a toddler, probably around 4 or 5 years old, small enough that the plane must have seemed enormous to her, like a giant machine from another world. She climbed into the seat with help from adults nearby. Cameras came out. People smiled. To them, it was innocent. Just a child sitting in a plane, pretending to be a pilot, touching buttons and switches without understanding what they did. The adults likely assumed everything was safe. After all, the plane was parked. It wasn't flying. It was part of a museum. Nothing like this was supposed to be dangerous anymore. What they didn't realize or didn't fully think through was that not everything on the plane had been completely disabled. Some systems were still active. As the girl sat there surrounded by unfamiliar controls, she did what curious children do. She reached out and pressed a button. To her, it was probably just another switch. Something interesting. Something that made her feel like she was really part of the plane. She had no way of knowing what it was for. The button she pressed was part of the ejection system. In military planes, that system exists for one reason. If a plane is damaged or shot down, the pilot can be launched out of the aircraft into the air, away from the crashing plane, giving them a chance to survive. It is not a gentle system. It is violent, fast, and powerful. It is designed to work instantly without hesitation. The plane was on the ground. The girl was not wearing a parachute. She was not prepared in any way. When she pressed the button, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. In an instant, she was launched upward with incredible force. There was no time for anyone to react. No time to understand what was happening. One moment she was sitting in the plane, and the next she was shot high into the air above it. People screamed. Confusion spread through the crowd. Some didn't even understand what they were seeing at first. It was so sudden and so wrong that it didn't make sense. A child should not be flying through the air like that. Not at a museum, not at a family event. She reached a height that no human body, especially a child's, could survive falling from without protection. Then she came down. She died from the fall. The shock of it rippled through everyone who was there. Parents grabbed their children. People stood frozen, unable to move, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A day that had started with excitement and curiosity ended in horror and silence. The sound of laughter was replaced with crying, shouting, and sirens. My grandparents weren't there that day, but the story spread quickly through the town. Everyone seemed to know someone who knew the family or someone who had been at the show. The details were told and retold, sometimes quietly, sometimes with disbelief. People asked how it could have happened, how something so dangerous could have been left accessible, how a mistake like that could slip through. The answers didn't make the outcome any easier to accept. After that day, everything stopped. There were no more plane shows at that location. Ever. The museum may have continued in some form, but the public events ended. The joy and excitement that once surrounded the place were gone. The site became associated with tragedy instead of history. For my grandparents, the story stuck with them. They told it not in a dramatic way, but in a somber, almost careful tone. It wasn't gossip to them. It was a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how adults can make assumptions about safety that turn out to be devastating, how a single moment, a single action can change countless lives forever. They talked about the little girl with sadness, even years later. They didn't know her personally, but that didn't matter. In a small town, tragedies like that don't stay distant. They become part of the shared memory, part of the place itself. What makes the story especially haunting is how ordinary it began. A family outing, a museum, a child smiling for pictures. There was no warning, no obvious danger, just a system that should have been fully disabled and a child doing what children do. Ever since then, whenever people talk about that old airport area, the story comes up. It's impossible to separate the place from what happened there. The runways, the planes, the hangars, all feel quieter now, heavier somehow, as if the land itself remembers. When my grandparents told me the story, they didn't exaggerate it. They didn't need to. The facts alone were enough. A toddler, a button, a fall, an end to something that once brought people together. It's the kind of story that stays with you, not because of gore or mystery, but because of how real and senseless it is. There was no villain in the usual sense, no bad intentions, just a terrible oversight and an irreversible outcome. And because of that, the place never hosted another show again. What was meant to celebrate history became a reminder of loss. A reminder that even places meant for learning and fun can become dangerous if care is not taken. A reminder that some mistakes can never be undone. That's how my grandparents told it, quietly, seriously, as something that should never be forgotten. Alfredo Rampi, known by everyone as Alfredino, was a 6-year-old Italian child whose death became one of the most painful and unforgettable tragedies in modern Italian history. What happened to him was not just a private family disaster. It unfolded slowly, publicly, and helplessly in front of an entire nation that watched and listened as a little boy slipped further and further away from rescue. On the evening of June 10, 1981, Alfredo was in a rural area near the village of Frascati, not far from Rome. It was a quiet place, the kind of countryside where children could still run freely, and adults believed the land was safe. Somewhere in that area was an abandoned well. It was not properly sealed or protected. It was narrow, dark, and dangerously deep. But it did not look threatening at first glance. To a child, it was just another opening in the ground, another curiosity. At some point that evening, Alfredo fell into the well. The well was horrifyingly narrow, only about 30 centimeters wide. There was no room to move freely, no space to turn around. It dropped straight down into darkness, reaching a depth of about 80 meters. When the first rescuers arrived and tried to understand where Alfredo was, they estimated that he was trapped about 36 meters below ground level. He was alive, conscious, and crying. His voice echoed from deep underground, thin and frightened, but unmistakably human. From the very beginning, the rescue was incredibly difficult. The well was too narrow for an adult to descend safely. There was no easy way to reach him directly. Every decision had to be improvised, and every mistake carried terrible consequences. The rescuers knew time was critical, but they were also working with limited tools and knowledge. This kind of rescue had almost never been attempted before. The decision was made to drill a second parallel shaft next to the well. The idea was to reach Alfredo from the side, then break through and pull him out. It sounded reasonable, even hopeful. Heavy machinery was brought in and drilling began. The noise was constant. The ground shook. Dust filled the air. Above ground, people worked frantically. Below ground, Alfredo waited in darkness. What no one fully anticipated was how dangerous the drilling itself would be. As the shaft was being dug, vibrations traveled through the earth. The well walls were unstable. At some point during the drilling, Alfredo slipped. He fell an estimated 30 meters further down the well. Instead of being closer to rescue, he was now much deeper, wedged even tighter, farther from reach. The news of his fall devastated everyone involved. The rescue had not only failed to help him, it had made his situation worse. By then, the story had already captured the attention of the entire country. Italian television began broadcasting the rescue live. What started as news coverage turned into an almost continuous transmission that lasted for about 18 hours non-stop. Millions of people watched. Families gathered around their televisions. People stayed awake through the night. The nation held its breath together. Viewers could hear Alfredo's voice through a microphone lowered into the well. They heard him cry. They heard him call for help. They heard him respond when rescuers spoke to him. His voice made everything unbearably real. This was not a distant tragedy. This was a living child, trapped, scared, and slowly running out of strength. As the hours passed, the rescue attempts became more desperate. At one point, it was decided that a volunteer would be lowered into the well. This was an incredibly dangerous decision. The well was narrow, unstable, and deep. The volunteer had to be extremely thin to even fit. He was secured with ropes and carefully lowered down inch by inch into the darkness. People above ground watched in silence. Millions at home watched too, knowing that this was probably Alfredo's last real chance. The volunteer managed to reach Alfredo. For a moment, there was hope. He spoke to the child. He tried to calm him. He attempted to place a harness around Alfredo's body so he could be pulled up. But Alfredo was stuck in mud and debris. His body position made it almost impossible to secure the harness properly. Every movement risked pushing him further down. The volunteer tried again and again, his arms shaking, his strength fading, his time running out. He failed. When he was pulled back up, the sense of defeat was overwhelming. The rescue had reached Alfredo, but still could not save him. More attempts followed. Different methods were tried, different volunteers went down. Each attempt seemed to make things worse. Alfredo slipped lower and lower. His voice, once clear and desperate, grew weaker. He spoke less. He responded more slowly. The microphone transmitted long stretches of silence, broken only by faint sounds that were hard to interpret. The entire country listened. People cried in their homes. Strangers prayed together. Some screamed at the television in frustration. Others sat in complete silence, unable to look away but unable to hope anymore. This was not just a rescue operation. It had become a collective trauma. By the early morning hours of June 13th, Alfredo's voice could barely be heard. Around 6:30 a.m., it is believed that he died. There was no dramatic moment, no clear announcement at first. The silence itself was the sign. When another volunteer was lowered into the well and tried once again to secure a harness, he realized the truth. Alfredo was no longer alive. The rescue was over, but the story did not end there. Recovering Alfredo's body proved almost as difficult as trying to save him. The well was still dangerous. The ground was unstable. It took weeks of careful work to reach him safely. His body was finally recovered on July 11th, 1981, 28 days after his death. Nearly a month after the nation had watched him die, he was finally brought back to the surface. The impact of Alfredo's death was enormous. Italy had never experienced anything like it. The live broadcast changed how people thought about television, media, and tragedy. For the first time, a rescue attempt had been turned into a national spectacle, with every failure and every moment of suffering shared in real time. Many later questioned whether it should have been broadcast at all, whether the pressure and exposure made things worse. Alfredo's parents were left shattered. Their private grief had been lived out in front of millions. There was no quiet mourning, no space to collapse in peace. Their child's final hours had become part of public memory. The incident led to changes in safety laws, emergency response procedures, and media ethics. Wells across the country were inspected and sealed. Rescue techniques were studied and improved. But none of that could undo what had happened. What makes Alfredo's story so haunting is not just the way he died, but how long it took. He was alive for days, trapped in darkness, listening to voices above him, believing help was coming. He did not die instantly. He waited. He hoped. And an entire nation waited with him. Even decades later, people in Italy remember where they were when they watched Alfredino's rescue on television. His name is still spoken with sadness. His story is taught, discussed, and remembered not as entertainment, but as a warning and a wound. A 6-year-old child fell into a hole that should never have been open. Adults tried everything they could, but knowledge, tools, and luck were not enough. Technology failed, planning failed, and time ran out. Alfredo Rampi did not just die in a well. He died slowly, publicly, and helplessly, while millions watched and could do nothing. That is why his story still hurts. That is why it is still told. And that is why it will never truly be forgotten. It happened in 2007 during a convoy in Iraq. Even now, years later, the memory comes back with a level of clarity that makes it feel like it never really ended. Some things don't fade. They just sit in your head, waiting for the wrong moment to resurface. We were moving along one of the main freeways in the area. It wasn't some quiet back road. It was a major route with lots of merges, exits, and turnoffs. Those were always the worst places. Anywhere traffic patterns changed was dangerous. Vehicles could slow down suddenly. Someone could cut in, someone could stop, or someone could do something far worse, and by the time you realized it, it was already happening. I was the last gunner in the convoy. That position comes with its own kind of tension. The last vehicle always faces the rear. You're watching everything behind you, constantly scanning, always expecting something to come from the direction everyone else isn't looking. You don't get the comfort of watching where you're going. You're focused on what's chasing you, what's following too closely, what's acting wrong. Convoys are loud, but you get used to the noise. Engines, radios, wind, the constant hum of movement. That day felt routine at first. No immediate signs of trouble. Traffic was there, but nothing unusual. Still, your body never fully relaxes. Even on quiet days, part of you stays tight, waiting. Then it happened. I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a horrible crunch, deep and violent, the kind of sound that cuts through everything else. Before my brain could fully process it, my truck slammed on the brakes hard. The sudden stop threw my body forward. Instinct kicked in immediately. I twisted around, looking over my shoulder, trying to see what had happened behind us. That's when I heard the screaming. Not the kind of yelling you hear in traffic, not angry shouting. This was raw panic. At the same time, gunfire erupted. Everything went from routine to chaos in seconds. Radios lit up, commands were shouted, training took over because there was no time to think. We pushed out fast. Everyone moved into position, forming a defensive perimeter around the convoy. Vehicles angled outward. Gunners scanned every direction. Weapons were up. Eyes were everywhere. In moments like that, you don't feel fear the way people imagine it. There's no time for it. Your body just reacts. You move because that's what you've been trained to do. Our third truck had been hit. At first glance, it looked like a bad accident, like some idiot had plowed into us without paying attention. But the impact was massive. This wasn't a tap or a mistake. This was full speed. The guy had rammed straight into the truck like it was a demolition derby. No braking, no hesitation, just pure force. The vehicle that hit us was a big flatbed truck, a stake bed loaded with tall gas tanks, the kind used for oxygen or helium. They were strapped upright, lined up in rows. Even without knowing anything else, that alone was terrifying. Those tanks were dangerous on their own. Under the wrong conditions, they could turn into missiles. We cleared the area first. That's always priority. You don't rush the vehicle until you know no one else is coming in behind it. No secondary attackers. no one trying to take advantage of the chaos. Once the immediate threat was contained, we moved in to inspect the truck. That's when the reality of what almost happened started to sink in. The truck wasn't just a vehicle full of gas tanks, it was wired to explode. About 100 pounds of homemade explosives were packed into it. Not small stuff. Enough to turn the entire convoy into debris. Enough to kill everyone nearby. The gas tanks were full, adding another layer of destruction. Fire, shrapnel, pressure. Everything stacked together into one massive bomb on wheels. It was a textbook suicide attack. The guy hadn't missed. He hadn't hesitated. He had done exactly what he intended to do. He hit us with everything he had. The only reason we were still standing was because something failed. The impact was so violent that it ripped the wires off the battery. The ignition source for the explosives lost power. The circuit broke. The bomb didn't go off. That was it. No miracle shield. No heroic last-second move. No warning that saved us. Just bad wiring. Just a mistake. Just someone who couldn't solder well enough to finish the job properly. That realization is what still messes with my head. We didn't survive because we were smarter, or faster, or better trained in that moment. We survived because the person trying to kill us made a small technical error, a loose connection, a wire that couldn't hold under impact. That's a terrifying thing to live with. When you think about combat, you expect danger to come from gunfire, from explosions that happen. You don't expect your survival to depend on someone else's incompetence, knowing that your life and the lives of everyone around you came down to whether or not a wire stayed connected is hard to accept. After everything was secured, after the adrenaline started to fade, the weight of it hit me. I kept replaying it in my head. The sound, the brakes, the screaming, the gunfire, the image of that truck slamming into ours. I thought about how close it was, how easily it could have gone the other way. If those wires had stayed connected, there wouldn't have been time to react. There wouldn't have been a perimeter. There wouldn't have been survivors. It would have been instant. That thought doesn't leave you. Even now, years later, it still shows up in my nightmares. Sometimes it's the sound of the crunch. Sometimes it's the feeling of the truck stopping so hard, it feels like your spine is going to snap. Sometimes it's the realization afterward. Standing there, looking at the explosives, understanding how close you came to being erased. What really stays with me is the randomness of it, the unfairness. You can do everything right and still almost die because of something completely out of your control. You can follow every procedure, stay alert, do your job perfectly, and still end up relying on luck. That kind of knowledge changes you. It makes it hard to trust the idea that things happen for a reason. It makes you realize how thin the line is between alive and gone. One bad solder joint, one wire pulled loose, one fraction of a second. Sometimes I think about the guy in the truck, about his certainty, about how sure he must have been that he was going to succeed. He committed fully, he didn't hesitate, and yet he failed in the smallest, most mundane way possible. And that failure is the only reason I'm here. That's what gives me nightmares. Not just the violence, but the understanding that survival wasn't earned. It was accidental, it was fragile. It could have been taken away by something as simple as a wire holding together for one more second. People ask what combat is like, and they expect stories about firefights or explosions. They don't expect this part, the part where you realize how meaningless skill can feel when luck is the final deciding factor. I still see that truck sometimes when I close my eyes, still hear that sound, still feel that brake slam, and every time I know exactly how close we were, closer than anyone should ever be. In the early 1990s, my girlfriend's aunt was a stay-at-home mom living just outside Wichita, Kansas. It was a quiet area, the kind of place where people waved at each other while driving past, where neighbors knew one another's routines, and where doors were often left unlocked during the day. Life moved slowly there. Nothing ever really happened, and that sense of safety was something people didn't even think about. It was simply assumed. At the time, she and her husband had decided to put their house up for sale. They had a newborn son, and like many young families, they were thinking about the future, a bigger place, a better layout, something that fit the next stage of their lives. Her husband worked during the day, leaving her home alone most afternoons with the baby. That was normal. She spent her days feeding him, rocking him to sleep, cleaning, and doing the quiet, repetitive tasks that fill the hours when you're caring for an infant. One afternoon, while her husband was at work, a man stopped by the house. He said he was interested in buying it and asked if he could take a look around. There was no appointment, no realtor with him, nothing official. But this was the early 90s, and this was a small town. People trusted each other. It didn't immediately raise alarms. She didn't think twice about it. She let him inside. The man seemed normal at first, polite enough, calm. He didn't rush. He walked through the house slowly, looking at the walls, the floors, the windows. She followed him from room to room, while holding her newborn son in her arms. The baby was small, warm against her chest, completely dependent on her. At the time, that felt natural, not dangerous. She was in her own home. She was a mother. She felt protected by routine and familiarity. As the man walked through the house, he asked basic questions. How old was the house? How long had they lived there? Had they done any renovations? His voice didn't stand out as threatening. Still, something about him felt slightly off. Not enough to make her stop the tour, but enough to make her pay attention. Eventually, he asked to see the basement. The basement wasn't a place she liked very much. It was unfinished, dim, and cold. Still, it was part of the house, and people often wanted to see it. She hesitated for just a second, then agreed. As they walked downstairs, she noticed his behavior change. He became more focused, more intent. He asked questions that didn't seem necessary. He lingered. That was when the feeling hit her. She couldn't explain it clearly, even now. It wasn't a single thought or fear. It was more like her body reacted before her mind did. A deep sense of unease settled in her chest. The air felt heavier. The silence felt louder. She suddenly became very aware of the fact that she was alone in a basement with a stranger holding a newborn baby. Her instincts started screaming at her. She tried to stay calm, but her heart was racing. The man stood too close. His eyes didn't move the way they should have. He seemed less interested in the house and more interested in her, in the baby, in the situation. Without fully thinking it through, she made a decision. She turned and quickly headed back up the stairs, raising her voice as she went. She shouted that her husband was home. She called out his name, loud enough to sound convincing, as if he had just walked through the front door. The reaction was immediate. The man panicked. He rushed up the stairs behind her, his calm demeanor gone in an instant. He didn't say a word. He didn't argue or ask questions. He bolted past her, ran through the house and out the front door. Within seconds, he was gone. She stood there, shaking, holding her baby tightly, trying to understand what had just happened. The house felt different now, unsafe, too quiet. She locked the door and sat down, her heart pounding, replaying every moment in her head. She told herself she was probably overreacting, that maybe he was just startled, that nothing had actually happened. But she couldn't shake the feeling. When her husband came home later that day, she told him everything. She explained how the man showed up unannounced, how he insisted on seeing the basement, how strange he became, and how he ran out the moment she claimed her husband was home. Her husband listened carefully, He didn't dismiss her fear. He didn't tell her she was imagining things. He told her not to show the house again unless he was home. Life moved on after that. The house eventually sold. They raised their son. Years passed. The memory of that day faded into the background of their lives, becoming just one of those odd stories you tell once in a while. Something strange, but not something that defined them. Then, in 2004, everything changed. She was watching the local news one evening when a familiar face appeared on the screen. The story was about a man who had finally been identified and arrested after years of terrorizing the Wichita area. As the camera showed his photo, her stomach dropped. She recognized him immediately. It was the man who had been in her house, the man who walked through her rooms, the man who followed her into the basement, the man who ran when she said her husband was home. He was the BTK killer. In that moment, the past crashed into the present. All those years of brushing it off, of telling herself it was nothing, suddenly felt terrifying. She realized how close she had come to something unimaginable, how thin the line was between an ordinary afternoon and a tragedy that would have changed everything. When she tells the story now, she still gets anxious. Her voice speeds up. Her hands move as she talks. You can see the fear resurface in her eyes even decades later. But there's something else there too, a strange mix of disbelief and dark humor. She knows how close she came. She knows how lucky she was. She sometimes laughs nervously and says she missed possible death by an inch. It's chilling to think about how small decisions can change everything. Letting a stranger inside, walking into a basement, raising her voice at the right moment, trusting an instinct she couldn't explain. If she hadn't followed that feeling, if she hadn't claimed her husband was home, if the baby hadn't been in her arms, things could have ended very differently. Her life, her child's life, all of it could have been taken away in a quiet house on a normal day. That's what makes the story so unsettling. Nothing dramatic happened in the moment. No violence, no struggle, just a feeling, just a choice. And years later, the horrifying realization of what almost was. I'm grateful she's safe. Grateful that instinct saved her. And every time she tells the story, even with the anxiety and nervous laughter, it's impossible not to feel the weight of it. A reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it knocks politely and asks to see the basement. My grandmother had type 2 diabetes for many years. Everyone in the family knew it. Doctors had warned her again and again about what could happen if she didn't take care of herself, but she never really listened. She continued eating huge amounts of sugar, far more than anyone with diabetes ever should. It wasn't just the occasional treat, it was constant. Chocolate bars, sweets, cakes. She brushed off concerns and acted like it didn't matter. If anyone tried to say something, she would get defensive or lie and say she was being careful. For a long time, it seemed like nothing bad was happening. She was old, yes, but she was still alive, still talking, still stubbornly independent. That made it easier for everyone to believe, or maybe want to believe, that things weren't as serious as the doctors said. But recently, we found out just how wrong that was. Her diabetes had started affecting her feet. I haven't seen her feet myself, and part of me is grateful for that. But my dad, her son, has seen them. He told us what they looked like, and the descriptions alone were enough to make my stomach turn. He said the flesh looked like it was being eaten away. The skin wasn't just damaged or discolored. It was brown, dead-looking, like it was rotting. This wasn't something that had happened overnight. This kind of damage takes time. It meant her body had been breaking down slowly, quietly, while she kept pretending everything was fine. A couple of days ago, we took her out for tea and cake. It feels almost surreal to think about now. She was sitting there, wrapped up, her legs bandaged, acting like it was just a normal outing. But something was very wrong. Flies kept landing on her legs. They were drawn to the smell of rotting flesh beneath the bandages. People swat flies away in the summer all the time, but this was different. These flies weren't random. They knew something was decaying. They crawled all over her bandaged legs, and it was horrifying to realize why. The bandages themselves were soaked through. The rotting flesh underneath was oozing lymph, a yellowish fluid, and it stained the bandages yellow and brown. She sat there like that, in public, and somehow no one stopped it. No one forced the issue. She had hidden how bad things were for so long that even now, when it was obvious something was terribly wrong, it still felt unreal. Today, everything came crashing down. A neighbor, who was also a friend of my grandmother, called my dad. She said my grandmother had fallen again. It was the third fall in just a few days. This time her legs were bleeding badly. An ambulance was called and she was taken to the hospital. My dad later showed us pictures he had taken inside her house, and those images are burned into my mind, even though I wish they weren't. There was a dark red splatter soaked into the pale green carpet. It wasn't a small stain. It was the kind of mess that tells you someone was hurt badly. Blood had pooled and spread, sinking into the fibers. In another photo, you could see splatters and smears where she had walked through the house. Each step left behind pieces of the horror she was carrying with her. The floors were marked by the remains of her rotting feet as she had frantically tried to move, probably in pain, probably scared, probably still refusing to fully accept what was happening to her body. What scares me the most isn't just how bad it got. It's the fact that she let it get that bad. Her legs didn't suddenly start rotting overnight. This wasn't an accident or a sudden illness. It must have been going on for a long time, weeks, months, maybe longer. She would have felt pain. She would have seen the changes. She would have known something was wrong. And yet she kept going. She kept eating sugar. She kept lying to her family. She kept choosing denial over help. If she were younger, doctors would probably amputate her legs. It would be drastic, but it might save her life. But she's 94 years old. She's very ill. She needs oxygen just to breathe. Surgery would likely kill her. Her body is too weak to survive something like that. So there are no real options left. There's no fixing this. There's only managing the damage and waiting for the end. No one in the family says it out loud, but we all know what's coming. She is going to die soon, and the way she is dying sounds incredibly painful. The thought of her trying to walk on legs that are literally rotting away is terrifying. It's hard to imagine how much agony she must have been in, and how long she must have endured it in silence. What makes it even worse is knowing that this didn't have to happen. This wasn't fate. This wasn't unavoidable. She could have prevented this. She could have taken her diabetes seriously. She could have changed her diet. She could have accepted help. Instead, she chose to keep eating massive dairy milk bars every week, ignoring every warning, brushing off every concern. Now her body is paying the price. Once she's gone, I won't have any paternal grandparents left. That realization feels strange and heavy. It's not just about losing her. It's about the closing of a chapter in my life. A part of my family history disappearing. The idea of rotting feet feels like something out of a nightmare. The kind of nightmare a child might have after hearing a scary story. Something unreal, exaggerated, impossible. Even now, it feels like something my mind shouldn't be able to accept. Except this isn't a nightmare. This is real. Later that morning, everything changed again. She died today at 6:00 a.m. in England. Right now it's 9:50 a.m. Her diabetes caused her organs to fail. After everything her body had endured, it finally gave up. We didn't get a chance to say goodbye. There was no final conversation, no closure, no moment to prepare ourselves. She was just gone. That part hurts in a strange, distant way. But what complicates everything is the kind of person she was. She was not a kind woman. She was often cruel, bitter, and difficult. Being around her was exhausting. She hurt people with her words and behavior. At the same time, it's impossible to ignore that she had a deeply damaging childhood. She grew up in circumstances that shaped her into the person she became. That doesn't excuse how she treated others, but it explains some of it. She was broken long before diabetes ever touched her body. Because of that, I don't feel the kind of sadness I expected to feel. I don't feel overwhelming grief. I don't feel the deep emotional loss people talk about when someone dies. And that makes me uncomfortable in its own way. This is the first family death I've ever experienced. I've never lost someone I knew well before. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. I don't know how this will affect me later. Right now, there's just a mix of shock, unease, and a quiet sense of finality. The horror of what she went through. The frustration of knowing it was preventable. The strange emptiness of knowing she's gone, even though she was never someone who brought warmth into my life. Maybe the feelings will come later. Maybe they won't. All I know is that this whole situation has left a deep impression on me. It's a reminder of how denial can destroy a body, how stubbornness can turn into suffering, and how real life can be far more disturbing than any nightmare. This wasn't a story meant to scare children. This was a real person. And this is how it ended. When I was around 10 years old, there was a terrible accident on the bridge near where I lived at the time. It happened in Wylam, a small village where people generally knew each other, and where serious tragedies felt rare and deeply personal. It's the kind of place where events don't just happen and disappear. They stay. They become part of the shared memory of everyone who lives there. My family had moved into the area a few years before the accident. The house we lived in wasn't new to us in spirit, because the family who had owned it before us hadn't moved far. They relocated just around the corner, close enough that our lives naturally overlapped. Over time, we became friends. It wasn't forced or formal. It was the kind of easy connection that happens in small places where familiarity grows naturally. They had a daughter who was older than me, old enough to babysit. She had grown up in the house we now lived in, and I slept in what used to be her bedroom. Because of that, she always had stories. She would talk about growing up in the house, about things she remembered from when she was younger, about little moments that made the place feel alive. To me, she felt like part of the house itself, like someone who belonged there even after she had moved out. She was at university by then, but every holiday she came home. Whenever she was back, she would babysit us. She was the kind of person kids trusted easily. She had a great smile, an easy laugh, and a warmth that made you feel comfortable. She didn't talk down to us, she talked to us like we mattered. Even as a child, you could tell she had a good future ahead of her. She felt steady, safe, like someone who would always be there. One night, everything changed. I don't remember the exact date. I think it was around Christmas or New Year's, but I'm not completely sure. What I do remember is that it was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into everything, the kind of night where the air feels heavy and quiet. I woke up early that morning to the sound of my parents crying. That alone was terrifying. As a child, you expect your parents to be strong, to be in control. Hearing them cry, really cry, shook something deep inside me. I knew immediately that something was wrong, something serious, something that couldn't be fixed easily. They were upset in a way I had never seen before. Not just sad, but broken, stunned, like the world had tilted and they were trying to understand how to stand upright again. I didn't fully understand what had happened at first. I just knew it was bad. Then they told me. The girl whose old room I slept in had died. The same girl who used to babysit us. the one who told stories about the house, the one with the bright smile and kind personality, the one who felt like a permanent part of our lives, even though she was technically grown up and moving forward with her own future. She was gone. She had gone out with some friends that night. They were young adults, enjoying themselves, doing what young people do. There had been drinking, but from what everyone said later, she herself was sober. She wasn't the reckless one. She wasn't the irresponsible one. That detail has always stuck with me, because it makes the whole thing even harder to accept. As they were crossing the bridge in Wylam, something went wrong. No one knows exactly why. There was no clear explanation that made sense. The car somehow lost control and went off the bridge. It didn't just scrape the side or slow down. It left the road entirely and fell onto the concrete overflow below. All 4 of them died. They drowned. 4 young adults full of life, with plans and futures and families who loved them, were gone in an instant. There was no good reason, no clear mistake you could point to and say, that's why. Just a chain of events that ended in something irreversible. The bridge itself became a symbol of that night. It wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a reminder. Every time you crossed it, you thought about what had happened, about how close it was, about how easily something ordinary could turn deadly. Every year after that, her mother would put flowers on the bridge. Without fail, she would go there and leave them, quietly marking the place where her daughter's life ended. She was never the same again. Anyone who knew her could see that. Grief had settled into her in a way that didn't fade with time. It changed her. It aged her. It hollowed something out that never fully came back. The funeral was held at the local church, and it was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder. Some had known her well. Others had only known of her. But everyone felt the loss. In small communities, tragedy doesn't belong to just one family. It spreads. It touches everyone. I remember the weight of that day, even though I was young. The quiet conversations, the tears, the sense that something had been taken too soon. It was the first time I really understood that death wasn't just something that happened to old people or strangers on the news. It could happen to someone you knew, someone who had sat in your house, someone who had laughed with you. Later, I learned more details that made the story even more unsettling. The people who lived in the house at the end of the bridge had heard a loud bang in the early hours of the morning. It was sudden and sharp enough to wake them. They got up and checked the road, but they didn't see anything. The bridge was dark. There were no streetlights bright enough to show what had happened. They didn't see the hole in the fence where the car had gone through. So they went back inside. They had no idea that just beyond their sight, 4 people were trapped below, dying in the cold, dark water. That thought is hard to sit with. The idea that help was so close but the signs weren't clear enough. That a single missing detail, a hole in a fence hidden by darkness, meant the difference between life and death. No one blames them. How could they have known? But the reality of it makes the whole thing feel even more tragic. So many moments where things almost went differently. Almost. That accident stayed with me as I grew up. It changed the way I think about cars, about drinking, about responsibility. I never get into a car if the driver has been drinking. Not even just one. Not even if everyone else says it's fine. I don't care if it makes me awkward or difficult. I don't care if people think I'm being dramatic. I've seen what happens when things go wrong. I also try not to be too reckless when I'm drunk in a car. Even if I'm not the one driving, I stay aware. I speak up. I don't let things slide just to avoid being annoying. I know far too many stories like this. Stories where people thought they were fine. Stories where nothing bad was supposed to happen, and yet it did. What haunts me most is how ordinary it all was before it wasn't. A night out, a familiar road, a bridge people crossed every day without thinking. There was no sense of danger until it was too late. Even now, years later, I still think about her, about how young she was, about how she should have had decades ahead of her, about her mother placing flowers on the bridge year after year, standing in the cold, holding onto the only thing she can still do for her daughter. That bridge will always carry that weight, and so will I, because once you learn how fragile life can be, once you see how quickly it can be taken away for no clear reason, you don't ever really forget it. You just learn to live with the knowledge, hoping that remembering might stop it from happening again. My sister, my oldest sibling, had been born only about a month before this happened. My parents were very young back then. My mom wasn't even 20 years old yet, and she was still trying to figure out how to be a mother while barely feeling like an adult herself. They were living in a time of their lives where everything felt unstable, rushed, and intense. Money was tight, emotions were high, life hadn't settled into anything calm or predictable yet. My dad was a boxer at the time. He trained seriously and competed, and boxing wasn't just a sport to him, it was part of his identity. Along with that lifestyle came a certain crowd. Some of the people he hung around weren't exactly the safest or smartest to be around, and the neighborhood he spent time in wasn't known for being peaceful either. Violence wasn't unusual there. Fights happened, tempers flared easily, people took things personally even when nothing was meant by it. One night, my mom stayed home with my newborn sister. She was exhausted, emotional, and still recovering from giving birth. My dad went out with some friends. There was no big plan, just hanging out, killing time, doing whatever young men do when they don't want to be home yet. At some point during the night, they stopped at a gas station so my dad could grab something to eat. Inside that gas station, everything changed. Someone from the opposite side of town was there. He was involved in a gang, and for reasons that still don't fully make sense, he thought my dad had disrespected him. Maybe it was a look, maybe it was nothing at all. But in places like that, perception matters more than reality. The guy started yelling at my dad, accusing him of dogging him, basically thinking my dad had stared him down in a threatening way. My dad didn't go looking for trouble, but trouble found him anyway. By the time my dad stepped back outside, the situation had already escalated. The gang member followed him out and decided to start a fight. He wasn't alone. His friends were already waiting outside. When he threw the first punch, everything exploded into chaos. His group jumped in, and my dad's friends jumped in too. It turned into a full-on brawl right there in front of the gas station. People were shouting, fists were flying. It was loud, messy, and completely out of control. As fights like that often do, it started to break apart after a while. People from both sides began running off. Some were trying to get away from whoever they were fighting. Others just wanted to disappear before the police showed up. The crowd thinned quickly, leaving only a few people still involved. My dad was still fighting one guy. At one point, my dad managed to overpower him. He slammed the guy's face into a nearby pole and stepped back. He thought the fight was over. He assumed the guy would either back off or run away like everyone else had. That assumption almost killed him. Instead of retreating, the guy pulled out a knife. There was no warning, no time to react. He charged straight at my dad and slashed him across the abdomen. The blade tore him open so badly that his inside spilled out. My dad collapsed, bleeding heavily, his body literally falling apart in front of him. The guy didn't stay to see what he'd done. He ran. He left my dad there on the ground, alone, surrounded by blood, fully expecting him to die. Most people would have. But my dad didn't. Somehow, through shock, pain, and blood loss, he stayed conscious. He gathered himself as best he could, holding his own body together with his hands. He knew he couldn't stay there. He knew if he laid down and gave up, he would never get back up again. So he started moving, looking for his friend's car, stumbling and barely able to stay upright. One of his friends found him quickly. When he saw the condition my dad was in, there was no hesitation. He shoved my dad into the car and drove as fast as he could to the emergency room. They didn't slow down. They didn't stop to think. Survival was the only goal. When they reached the hospital, they dumped my dad at the door. My dad collapsed and passed out. His friends drove off immediately. They were terrified of being arrested. They knew if they stayed, they'd all be taken in for the fight, and fear made the decision for them. Doctors rushed my dad into surgery. Against all odds, he survived. He lived through injuries that should have killed him. He lived through massive blood loss. He lived through trauma that would have ended most people. He recovered enough to go on with his life. He and my mom had 2 more kids after that. I exist because he didn't die on that gas station pavement. My dad carries the proof of that night on his body. A massive scar runs across his entire abdomen in an upside-down V shape. It's not neat or thin. In some places, it's about 1/2 inch wide. In others, it's closer to 1.5 inches. It's impossible to ignore. It tells the story without words. For most of my life, I knew about the scar, but I didn't fully understand what it meant. About a month ago, I accidentally walked in on my mom talking with my dad's sisters. They were sitting together and they were talking about that night. I wasn't meant to hear it. They weren't speaking loudly, but the weight in their voices pulled me in before I could stop myself. They talked about how scared they were when they got the call, about how no one knew if my dad would survive, about how he looked when they visited him in the hospital. My dad is a big man, strong and broad, but they said when they saw him lying there, he looked like a skeleton. He had wasted away. Tubes everywhere, pale, fragile, nothing like the man they knew. They talked about how close they came to losing him just after he had become a father, how my mom was barely an adult herself, sitting at home with a newborn, not knowing if the man she loved would ever come back. How unfair and senseless it all was. Hearing that conversation changed something in me. It made the story real in a way it never had been before. It wasn't just a wild thing that happened long ago. It was a moment where my entire family's future almost disappeared. One stupid misunderstanding, one look taken the wrong way, one decision to step back instead of staying alert. That night could have ended everything. My dad eventually cleaned up his life. He quit boxing years ago. He stopped hanging around people who thrived on chaos and violence. He avoids situations like that completely now. He doesn't escalate things. He doesn't engage. He walks away. He understands how close he came to never seeing his children grow up. That experience changed him. He knows now how fragile life really is, how quickly it can be taken away over something meaningless, someone thinking you looked at them wrong, someone wanting to prove something, someone carrying a knife when fists should have been the end of it. When I think about that night, what scares me most isn't just the violence. It's how ordinary it started. A gas station, a late-night stop for food, a misunderstanding. No one woke up that day thinking it would end in blood and surgery and near death, and yet it almost did. My dad survived, but the lesson stayed with him forever. And now, hearing the full story, it stays with me too. A reminder that pride, ego, and momentary anger can destroy everything you love in seconds. A reminder that walking away isn't weakness, it's survival. Because sometimes, the difference between a life and a scar is nothing more than one bad decision made in the wrong place at the wrong time. I live in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, or at least thinks they do. It's the sort of town where faces become familiar even if you don't know names, where you recognize people by where they usually sit in the bar, what car they drive, or who they hang around with. There isn't much to do here, and there isn't much to talk about either. Life moves slowly. Gossip travels fast. Big news is rare, which makes it hit harder when it finally comes. The town is close to the capital, close enough that most people go there when they want a real night out. If you want clubs, parties, concerts, or anything that feels exciting, you leave town. That's what a lot of young people do. They go out, drink, dance, meet people, then come back home when the night is over. It's normal, it's routine. It's something no one really questions. That's what this girl did. She went out one night. There was a party. Nothing unusual about that. She was young, social, living her life like everyone else her age. She didn't come home. At first, people assumed it was nothing serious. Maybe she stayed at a friend's place. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she just needed space. In a small town, people try to stay calm at the beginning because panic spreads quickly. But as the hours turned into a full day and then another, concern started to creep in. Then the posts appeared. Her photo was everywhere. Missing person posts flooded social media. People shared them again and again, hoping someone, anyone, would recognize her or know something. The local pages were full of comments. Have you heard anything? Was she seen at this bar? Please come home. The police got involved fairly quickly, which only made things feel more serious. When the police step in early, it's never a good sign. The whole town felt tense. People talked about it in hushed voices at the bar, at the store, on the street. Everyone had a theory. Everyone hoped for the best. But deep down, most of us were afraid of what the truth might be. In places like this, when someone disappears, it doesn't stay abstract. It feels personal, even if you didn't know them well. About a week later, they found her. She was buried in the woods not far from where I live. That detail alone still makes my stomach turn. The woods aren't some distant, unknown place. They're familiar. People walk there. Kids play there. You pass them without thinking. Knowing that her body was hidden there so close makes the whole thing feel suffocating. Like death had been sitting quietly near us all along. The police arrested the murderer not long after, and that's when it became truly chilling. I knew him. Not well, not deeply, but enough. We weren't friends, but we existed in the same social orbit in a small town. That's all it takes. We had exchanged hellos. We had sat at the same table at the bar before. We had been in the same spaces, breathing the same air, laughing at the same stupid jokes. We had attended the same drug prevention program at one point. I was friends with his sister's ex. Our lives had crossed in small, ordinary ways. He wasn't exactly pleasant to be around. There was something off about him, something uncomfortable, but nothing that screamed danger. He was awkward. A little intense, sometimes annoying, but there are a lot of people like that. If being unpleasant were a sign of murder, half the town would be locked up. That's what scares me the most. You never would have guessed what he did, or how he did it. The details came out slowly, piece by piece, and each one made things worse. She had called him that night. She needed a ride home. That alone is terrifying, because it's such a normal thing to do. We all do it. We call someone we know, someone we trust enough, someone who seems safe. She wasn't calling a stranger. She wasn't doing something reckless. She was asking for help getting home. He picked her up. Instead of taking her home, he drove her out to the middle of nowhere, the boonies, dark roads, no witnesses, no houses nearby, a place where no one would hear anything. Somewhere quiet enough to do whatever he wanted without interruption. At some point, he told her he was in love with her, madly in love. It didn't matter that he already had a girlfriend. It didn't matter that this wasn't the time or place. It didn't matter that she hadn't asked for this confession. He wanted sex. He wanted her. He believed he was entitled to her because of his feelings. She said no. That should have been the end of it. A no is a no, that's it. Nothing more needs to be said. But for him, it wasn't acceptable. Her refusal wasn't just rejection, it was an insult, a denial of something he believed he deserved. So he stabbed her 13 times, not once, not in a moment of blind panic. 13 deliberate, violent acts, each one a choice, each one a moment where he could have stopped, where he could have pulled away, where he could have realized what he was doing and ended it. He didn't. After he killed her, he buried her in the woods. He hid her body like it was something to be disposed of, not a human being with a life, a family, friends, plans, and a future. He covered up what he had done and left her there, alone in the ground. Then he went home. He took a shower. He got into bed with his girlfriend, as if nothing had happened. That detail haunts me more than almost anything else. The normality of it. The ease with which he slipped back into his life. The way he washed the blood off his body and lay down next to someone who trusted him, who loved him, who had no idea what he had just done. It gets worse. He shared her missing person reports on Facebook. He posted them like everyone else, like a concerned acquaintance, like someone hoping for her safe return. He watched the town search for her. He saw people begging for information. He saw her face everywhere, knowing exactly where she was and what he had done. That level of cruelty is hard to comprehend. When the truth came out, it shattered something in the town. People didn't just grieve for her. They questioned everything, every interaction, every familiar face, every casual hello exchanged at the bar. The idea that someone capable of this could sit among us, unnoticed, pretending to care, pretending to be normal, was deeply unsettling. I replay every interaction I ever had with him in my head, every conversation, every glance, every moment where nothing seemed wrong. I wonder if there were signs I missed, or if there truly were none. That's the most frightening possibility of all. That sometimes there are no clear warnings. Sometimes monsters don't look like monsters. They look like people you recognize. They look like someone who sits at your table and orders a drink, someone who complains about work, someone who laughs at the same stories you do, someone who shares missing person posts and pretends to be part of the community. After that, the town felt different, smaller, tighter, less safe. The illusion that nothing bad happens here was gone forever. People locked their doors more often. Parents worried more. Friends checked in on each other constantly. Trust became something fragile. I think about her a lot, about how she did everything right. She went out. She called someone she knew. She trusted the wrong person, and it cost her her life. That thought makes it hard to believe in simple safety rules. Because sometimes, even when you follow them, bad things still happen. I also think about how close this was to my own life, how easily it could have been someone else, how easily it could have been me, or someone I love. That realization doesn't fade. It settles into you and changes the way you see the world. The most chilling part isn't just the violence, it's the proximity, the familiarity, the fact that evil didn't come from some unknown outsider, but from someone woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. Someone we nodded at, someone we tolerated, someone we never truly knew. Now, when I sit in that bar, I look around differently. I notice people more. I question things I used to ignore. I understand in a way I didn't before that knowing someone's face doesn't mean knowing who they are. And I don't think I'll ever fully shake that feeling, because once you realize how close you were to something like that, once you understand how thin the line is between ordinary life and unimaginable horror, it never really leaves you. It just becomes part of how you move through the world, quieter, more cautious, and far less certain that you truly know the people around you. From 2012 to 2015, I worked as a Carney. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was a living. I worked for 2 different companies here in Washington, moving from town to town, setting up and tearing down rides, sleeping wherever we could, and living on schedules that never made sense. Carney life runs on exhaustion. Long hours are normal. Sleep is optional. You learn to function while tired because you don't really have a choice. By August of 2015, that exhaustion had become routine. On August 16th, we wrapped up a brutal stretch of work in Hermiston. We had worked almost non-stop, coming off a 23-hour shift. Most of us had maybe 2 hours of sleep, if that. Nobody felt good, but nobody complained either. That was just how it was. You pack up, you move on, you tell yourself you'll sleep later. We left Hermiston around 11 in the morning. The plan was to head north, pass through Olympia, then take Highway 101 toward Port Angeles. The drive was long, but we'd done worse. We were riding in an old 1977 RV, beat up, loud, and barely holding together. But it was what we had. One of my co-workers was driving. He was just as tired as the rest of us. But again, no one stopped to question it. At some point after we got up around Olympia, I passed out in the back of the RV. Not the kind of falling asleep where you ease into it. It was more like my body just shut down. 1 second I was awake, the next I was gone. That's what happens when you push yourself too far for too long. The next thing I remember is waking up and seeing the sky above me. That alone didn't make sense. I was inside the RV. I should have been looking at a ceiling or a wall or someone's boots. Instead, I was staring straight up at the sky. Everything felt wrong. My arm was pinned, crushed under something heavy, and I couldn't move it. I tried to shift my body, but nothing responded the way it should have. What made it even worse was that the vehicle was still moving. I could hear this awful sound, metal scraping against metal, a grinding noise that felt like it was tearing straight through my head. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew it was bad. Panic hit hard and fast. I started yelling, screaming for help, my voice raw and desperate. Help! Get this shit off me! Help! I don't know if anyone heard me. I don't know how long I was yelling. Everything was chaos. Pain, noise, confusion, fear, all mixed together. At some point, my body gave up again and I passed out. When I woke up the next time, I was in a hospital bed at Harborview Medical Center. The lights were bright. The air smelled like disinfectant. My body felt heavy and broken, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I couldn't move the way I wanted to. Everything hurt. For a moment, I didn't even remember who I was or how I got there. Then pieces started coming back, slow and painful. Doctors and nurses explained what had happened. While I was unconscious in the back of the RV, my co-worker fell asleep at the wheel. The exhaustion finally caught up to him. The RV drifted out of its lane and veered into oncoming traffic. A truck hit us, and it hit right where I had been laying, right where my body was. The impact was violent. I was thrown from where I had been sleeping and slammed into the back of the RV. When paramedics found me, I wasn't even visible at first. I had been wedged into a nightmare position, trapped between the spare tire and the toilet, crushed, twisted, barely accessible. They had to work to get me out. Hearing that afterward was surreal. I couldn't remember the crash itself. Just flashes, sky, pain, noise. But knowing how close I came to dying, knowing exactly where the truck hit, knowing how easily it could have been fatal, that knowledge settled into me in a way that never really left. Recovery wasn't quick. It wasn't simple. It still isn't over. Nearly 4 years later, my life looks nothing like it used to. I spend 8 hours a day in physical therapy, 5 days a week. Therapy isn't just stretching and light exercise like people imagine. It's pain, It's repetition. It's forcing your body to relearn things it used to do without thinking. Walking, lifting, turning, holding weight, enduring discomfort day after day, with no guarantee of how much improvement you'll actually get. Some days feel hopeful, some days feel endless. What messes with me the most is how preventable it all was. There was no storm, no drunk driver, no mechanical failure, just exhaustion, just someone being too tired to keep their eyes open, just a moment where no one said, "We need to stop." I think about that a lot. I think about how normal it felt at the time to be that tired, how everyone brushed it off, how we all told ourselves we'd be fine, that we'd sleep later, that we could push through one more drive, one more mile, one more hour. And I think about how close I came to never waking up at all. That crash didn't just break my body, it rewired my brain. I see fatigue differently now. I hear people joke about being exhausted and pushing through, and it makes my stomach tighten. I don't see toughness in it anymore. I see danger. I see what happens when tired turns into unconscious. I don't care who you are or how confident you feel. If you're tired, you are not safe behind the wheel. Not for yourself. Not for the people riding with you. Not for the strangers coming the other way who have no idea your eyes are about to close. I live with the consequences of that lesson every single day. So I'll leave it with this, because it's the only thing that really matters. If you're tired, pull the fuck over and sleep. No job, no schedule, no deadline, and no sense of pride is worth what it can cost. I learned that the hard way, and I wouldn't wish that lesson on anyone. These are 3 experiences from my life that don't connect in any obvious way, except that each one left a mark on me that never really faded. None of them feel like stories with clean beginnings and endings. They're more like moments where something went wrong, or almost went wrong, and then life just kept moving forward anyway. The first one happened when I was very young, around 6 years old, after my family moved halfway across the country. At the time, I didn't understand what was happening. I just knew that things felt tense and unstable in a way I couldn't explain. Looking back as an adult, with the benefit of hindsight and conversations with my father, it's clear that my mother was slowly losing her grip on reality. The move itself was hard. We left behind everything familiar and ended up in a place where my parents struggled financially. Bills piled up. Stress became constant, and my mother started changing. It wasn't sudden or dramatic at first. It was subtle. Mood swings, paranoia, fixations. My father didn't recognize what was happening at the time. It wasn't until years later, after joining a support group, that he realized how many warning signs he had missed. As my parents' marriage fell apart, my mother became more erratic. During the divorce process, she made a decision that would later terrify my father and confuse law enforcement. One day, without telling anyone, she took me and my younger brother and disappeared. No warning, no explanation. We were just gone. My father came home to an empty house and realized immediately that something was wrong. He had no idea where we were or why she had taken us. That sudden absence triggered a frantic search. Police were contacted, friends and family were alerted. It turned into a statewide hunt for 2 missing children. What made the situation even more dangerous was that my mother wasn't acting alone. She had the support of members of a church she was involved with. These people believed her version of events, which painted my father as abusive. Those accusations were completely false. But once a story like that takes hold in a community, especially a religious one, it spreads fast. Families helped her hide us. They gave her places to stay, food, transportation. They believed they were protecting children from a dangerous man. There was only one person in that extended web who didn't buy the story. It was the husband of a church friend's sister, someone who wasn't fully absorbed into the narrative. He noticed inconsistencies. Things didn't add up. The urgency, the secrecy, the way my mother spoke about my father didn't match what he knew of reality. He trusted his instincts and tipped off the police. That same night, my mother suddenly brought us back home, acting as if nothing had happened. No explanation, no apology. Just walked in like it was another normal day. And that was it. The police dropped the case entirely because she returned on her own. No charges, no follow-up, no protection order, nothing. What haunts me now is something my father realized later. The man who tipped off the police didn't live west, in the direction of our birth state, which would have made sense if she was simply trying to take us back home. He lived north, in the next state up. When you look at a map, that direction leads toward Canada. My father believed she was trying to take us out of the country. If that man hadn't spoken up, if the timing had been slightly different, we might have vanished completely. It would take 2 more years of escalating abuse, instability, and chaos before my father finally gained custody of us. Those years were filled with things no child should experience. Fear, manipulation, emotional damage that took a long time to even recognize, let alone heal from. In my 20s, I learned something else that reframed everything. My mother's father, my grandfather, had been deeply involved with organized crime. Not in a mythologized movie way, but in a brutal, real one. He had attempted a family annihilation at least once and failed. Knowing that history made my mother's behavior feel less random and more terrifying. Some legacies don't disappear, they mutate. The second experience happened years later after I had graduated high school. By then, my father had remarried, and our lives had stabilized in ways I never thought possible as a kid. That summer, my family went on vacation, and I stayed behind to work and save money for college. One night, I went out with friends to see the movie Signs. It was late when I got home. The house was dark and quiet, exactly as I had left it, but something immediately felt off. The door between the house and the garage was wide open. I knew I had closed it before leaving. That alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. I shut and locked it, then decided to check the house. I didn't want to assume the worst, but I also didn't want to ignore my instincts. I started clearing the house, room by room. When I reached the staircase, I hit the light switch for the second floor. The light flashed blindingly bright for a split second and then burned out completely. The bulb was dead. Suddenly, the second floor was pitch black. The problem was that all the flashlights were either upstairs in a linen closet that required crossing a dark landing with 4 bedrooms and a bathroom opening onto it, or downstairs in the basement, which had plenty of hiding places and blind corners. I stood there for a moment and decided absolutely not. Instead, I called a neighbor. She came over with her dad, and the 3 of us cleared the entire house using their flashlights. Every room, every closet, every corner, nothing. No one was there. No signs of forced entry. No obvious explanation. A couple of days later, my family came home. Almost immediately, my dad asked me what I had done with the matches. I had no idea what he was talking about. He told me there had been a large jar of matches in the kitchen, and every single one was gone. Then he asked me why I had used the master bathroom and not cleaned up after myself. I hadn't used it. He said there were long, dark hairs in the sink and shower. I was the only person in the family with long, dark hair. He assumed I was lying to avoid getting in trouble. I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong. Eventually, I broke down crying, which was unusual for me. That's when he realized I wasn't lying. To this day, we have no explanation. Someone was in that house. Someone used the bathroom. Someone took the matches, and whoever it was, they left without being seen. The third experience happened much more recently. This past summer, I was staying with my girlfriend at her mother's house down south. One night, around 2 a.m, we decided to go skinny dipping in the pool. It was quiet, warm, and peaceful. We were relaxed, laughing, just enjoying the moment. Then my girlfriend froze. She told me something was moving near the fence. At first, I couldn't see anything. I wasn't wearing my glasses. I stared hard into the darkness and noticed something moving that seemed darker than the darkness around it. It was moving incredibly fast, back and forth across the gravel, completely silent. It covered about 30 feet in a second or two. I went to get my glasses while she headed toward the door. As I put them on, the motion-activated lights came on. What we saw made my blood run cold. Projected onto the fence was a distorted shadow that looked almost like a chimpanzee. It was loping back and forth at high speed, still completely silent. The lighting was low and uneven, warping the shape, making it hard to judge size or detail. But it was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. We woke her mother. We grabbed flashlights. I picked up whatever I could use as a weapon. I have some combat training, so we moved carefully, sweeping the property in a way that would prevent anything from slipping past us unnoticed. There was nothing, no tracks, no sounds, no sign that anything had been there at all. Eventually, we told ourselves it had to be a cat, a neighbor's pet, something ordinary amplified by darkness and adrenaline. That explanation is the only one that lets me sleep. But even now, when I replay it in my head, I'm not fully convinced. I hope it was a cat, because if it wasn't, I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. This is a story that didn't happen to me directly, but it was told to me by a coworker, and the weight of it stuck with me in a way that surprised me. It's about her brother and a group of friends he grew up with, and the strange, tragic pattern that followed them through their lives. It isn't dramatic in a cinematic way. There's no single moment where everything explodes at once. Instead, it's a slow series of losses that feels almost cursed when you hear it laid out from beginning to end. There were 5 of them originally. They had all been friends for years, the kind of group that forms in childhood and survives into adulthood. They went to school together, hung out constantly, and stayed close, even after graduating high school. They weren't reckless kids or known troublemakers. Just a tight-knit group of young men who liked spending time together, drinking a little, and getting away from town when they could. Not long after high school, they decided to take a weekend trip up north to Minnesota. It was October, already cold enough that summer felt long gone, but not quite winter yet. The leaves were changing, the air was sharp, and everything had that quiet, empty feeling that northern places get in the off-season. Back then, the drinking age was lower, so they could legally go out to a bar without worrying about fake IDs or sneaking around. They went out for dinner and had a few drinks. Nothing excessive. According to the story, they weren't drunk, relaxed, maybe a little buzzed, but still aware of what they were doing. Afterward, they got back in the car and headed toward the cabin they were staying at. It should have been a simple drive. That's when the fog rolled in. It wasn't light fog or mist. It was thick, heavy fog, the kind that swallows headlights and makes familiar roads feel unfamiliar. Visibility dropped fast. The world beyond the windshield became a gray blur, and landmarks disappeared. Somewhere along the way, they took a wrong turn. They didn't realize it until it was too late. The road ended at a pier, and in the fog, they couldn't see where solid ground stopped and water began. The car went straight off the end and into the lake. The impact wasn't violent, but it was sudden and terrifying. Cold water rushed in as the car sank, nose first, down into the darkness. The lake was deep and freezing. The car settled about 15 feet underwater. Panic set in immediately. 4 of them managed to react quickly. The windows were open, either because they had been cracked or because someone rolled them down instinctively. Those 4 were able to get out through the windows, and swim up to the surface. The fifth friend didn't make the same choice. Instead of going toward the windows, he panicked and moved toward the back of the car. There was still an air pocket there, and in his fear, he chose what felt like safety in that moment. He stayed in the back seat, breathing the trapped air, while the rest of the car filled with water. Two of the friends made it to shore and ran for help. They were soaked, freezing, and terrified, but they knew they needed to get someone immediately. The other two stayed behind and tried to help the friend who was still trapped. They dove back down again and again, using the headlights of the submerged car as their only light source. The water was icy, stealing their breath and strength with every dive. Each time they reached the car, they could see him in the back, trapped, panicking, pounding, running out of time. There was nothing they could do. The water kept rising. The air pocket shrank. They watched their friend drown. That image alone is horrifying enough. Watching someone you love die, knowing you can't save them, knowing that one different decision might have changed everything. That kind of trauma doesn't fade easily. It stays with you whether you talk about it or not. After that night, the group was never the same. How could they be? One of them was gone, and the way he died was burned into the memories of the others. Still, they tried to move forward. They leaned on each other. They stayed friends. Life continued because it had to. A few years later, the four remaining friends went to a hunting cabin. It was meant to be a break, a chance to relax, drink, and spend time together like they used to. By then, they were older, but still close. The cabin was remote, surrounded by woods, quiet and isolated. They were drinking and hanging out inside when one of them said he was going outside to use the bathroom. It wasn't unusual. The cabin either didn't have indoor plumbing or it was just easier to step outside. He walked out the door and the others stayed inside, talking and drinking. Minutes passed. At first, no one thought much of it. People take their time sometimes. Maybe he wandered a little. Maybe he stopped to smoke or look around. But after 15 minutes or so, they started to wonder where he was. They went outside and called his name. No answer. They searched around the immediate area with flashlights, expecting him to stumble out of the darkness, laughing about getting turned around. But he didn't. The night stretched on, and their concern turned into fear. By morning, they called the police. Local volunteers joined the search. They combed the woods, the trails, the surrounding land. There was a nearby swamp, dark and dangerous, especially at night. The leading theory became that he had wandered into it and drowned, but no body was ever found. No clothing, no footprints, no sign of a struggle, nothing. He simply vanished. Losing a second friend in such a strange and unresolved way shattered what was left of the group. One death is traumatic. Two, under such circumstances, starts to feel unreal, like something is wrong beyond coincidence. The remaining three tried to cope in their own ways. They didn't stop living, but the shadow followed them. The third tragedy didn't happen with the group together, but it still feels connected. The three remaining friends eventually went their separate ways, as people do. Two of them settled down, started families, built relatively normal lives. The third stayed in contact with them, but moved out of state for a new job. As far as anyone knew, things were going well for him. There were no warning signs, no major red flags. He didn't talk about struggling or feeling overwhelmed. Then, one day, something happened that no one could have predicted. There was a domestic incident at his neighbor's house. Police were called to handle it. While the officers were dealing with that situation, this man came out of his own house with a gun. What happened next was fast and final. He didn't threaten anyone else. He didn't try to escape. He confronted the police in a way that left them no choice. He was shot and killed. It was ruled suicide by cop. The news stunned everyone who knew him. No one understood why. There were no known issues, no history of violence, no signs that he was spiraling. He had survived 2 horrific losses earlier in life, and maybe those experiences had left deeper scars than anyone realized. Maybe something finally broke, or maybe it was something else entirely that no one ever saw. That left 2. Out of the original 5 friends, only 2 remain alive today. They're living normal lives, raising families, going to work, doing all the things people are supposed to do. On the surface, everything is fine. But when you look at the pattern, it's hard not to feel uneasy. One friend drowned in a car accident that should never have happened. Another vanished into the night and was never found. A third died violently at the hands of police, under circumstances no one can fully explain. 3 out of 5 gone in ways that were sudden, traumatic, and deeply disturbing. It's been 15 to 20 years since the last incident. Enough time that the world has moved on. Enough time that people might say it's all just bad luck, coincidence, the randomness of life. And maybe that's true. But if I were one of the 2 remaining friends, I don't think I'd ever fully relax. I think I'd still look over my shoulder sometimes. I think I'd still feel that quiet sense of dread when I thought about the past. Not because I believe in curses or fate necessarily, but because surviving that much loss changes you. It makes you hyper-aware of how fragile everything is, how quickly life can take a turn, how easily people can disappear. What makes this story especially unsettling isn't just the deaths themselves, it's how ordinary everything around them was. A weekend trip, a hunting cabin, a new job, normal moments that turned into endings. There's no lesson here that feels comforting. There's no moral that ties it all up neatly. It's just a reminder that sometimes tragedy doesn't come once and leave you alone. Sometimes it circles back, again and again, touching the same group of people in different ways. And the ones who are left behind have to carry all of it. They carry the memory of watching a friend drown in cold, dark water. They carry the unanswered questions about someone who walked into the woods and never came back. They carry the shock of learning that someone they thought was okay died in the most violent way possible. Even if life looks normal now, that history doesn't disappear. It sits quietly in the background, waiting to be remembered. When I was a very young child, perhaps only 5 or 6 years old, I lived in a house that was unlike any other in our small town. It was an old train depot that had been converted into a family home. Because of its history, the building had a unique character, with high ceilings, large windows, and a lingering sense of the thousands of travelers who must have passed through its doors when the tracks were still active. Living there felt like living inside a piece of history. Right next to our home was another repurposed structure, a large old barn that had been turned into the town's main market. This store was the heart of our neighborhood, and it was run by a lovely Vietnamese couple who had become very close friends with my mother. They were kind, hard-working people, and my mother often spent time chatting with them while she did her grocery shopping. One particular evening, the air felt heavy and still as my mother and I began our short walk from our front door to the market. It was a typical small-town evening where you expect nothing but peace and quiet. But as we stepped outside, my mother stopped in her tracks. She crinkled her nose and looked around with a confused expression. There was a scent in the air that was hard to describe at first. It was thick, sweet in a sickly way, and incredibly putrid. It wasn't like the smell of a dead animal in the woods. It was much more intense and overwhelming. My mother didn't say much to me at first, likely trying to shield me from whatever it was, but she kept looking around the side of the old barn as we walked. When we stepped inside the market, the bell above the door chimed, and we saw the wife, a woman named Me, standing behind the wooden counter. Before my mother even picked up a basket, she asked me if she had noticed the horrible smell lingering just outside the doors. Mee sighed and leaned against the counter, looking exhausted. She told my mother that she had been smelling it all afternoon and that it had been giving her a headache. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she pointed toward the back of the property. She mentioned that there was a strange car parked out back that had been sitting there in the same spot all day long. According to Mai, the smell was significantly worse whenever she went near that vehicle. My mother and the couple talked for a few more minutes, their voices dropping into hushed, serious tones. Eventually, the couple decided that they couldn't ignore it any longer. They picked up the phone and called the local police, asking them to come and check out the abandoned car and perhaps have it towed away. We stayed in the store for a while, and soon enough, the quiet evening was interrupted by the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers. What started as a simple request for a tow quickly turned into something much more serious. The police officers didn't take long to realize that this wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. As they approached the car, they immediately covered their faces with their hands. I remember watching from a distance as they began to set up a yellow tape perimeter around the car and the back of the barn. In a small town like ours, news travels faster than the wind. Within 30 minutes, it seemed like almost everyone in town had stopped their cars or walked over from their houses to see what was happening. There was a crowd of people standing at the edge of the police line, whispering and staring at the car. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. When the officers finally forced open the trunk of that abandoned car, they found the body of a man who had been missing for some time. The summer heat had been relentless, and the trunk had acted like an oven. I don't know if I actually caught a glimpse of it myself, or if the description was so vivid from the adults talking later that it became a permanent image in my mind. But the detail that stuck with everyone was how the body looked. Because of the gases that build up during decomposition, the man's body had bloated to a terrifying degree. People described him as being blown up like a giant macabre balloon. It was a gruesome discovery for such a small, tight-knit community, and the image of that car and what was hidden inside stayed with me for years. It was the first time I realized that even in a place that feels safe, darkness can be parked right in your backyard. That wasn't the only time my hometown was touched by violence during those years. Not long after the incident at the market, another tragedy occurred, just a few houses down the street from where we lived. It was a double homicide, the kind of thing you only read about in newspapers from big cities. The rumors around town were that it was a drug deal that had gone terribly wrong. A group of men had come to a duplex down the street to collect a debt or settle a score, and they weren't interested in talking. The violence was brutal and sudden. One of the men inside the house was killed with a gun, a quick and violent end. But the second victim met an even more horrific fate. He had tried to run, making it as far as the front yard, but he was chased down and killed with a heavy piece of lumber, a 2A4. During all this chaos, there was a woman inside the house who had managed to hide. She had scrambled into the laundry room and buried herself under a massive pile of dirty clothes, holding her breath and praying that the killers wouldn't find her. She stayed there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the struggle and the final heavy silence that followed. Once she thought it was finally safe to move, she burst out of the house and ran to the nearest neighbor's home. She was covered in dust and trembling with fear, banging on the front door and screaming for help. The house she ran to belonged to the pastor of one of our local churches. You would think that a man of God, someone dedicated to helping those in need, would have opened the door immediately. But instead, the pastor ignored her. He heard her cries. He heard her desperate banging, and he chose to stay inside. He didn't even bother to pick up the phone to call 911. The poor woman had to run to another house, further down the block, before someone finally took her in and called the police. The town was outraged when they found out the pastor had turned his back on her. Many of the neighbors later claimed that they had heard the distinct, sickening crack of the wood hitting the victim's head in the front yard. Because it was the dead of night in such a small town, the sound traveled clearly through the cold air. The silence of the night made the violence feel even louder, a sharp contrast to the peaceful life we were all supposed to be living. These two events happening so close to my home and so early in my life changed the way I saw the world. I lived in an old train depot, a place built for movement and adventure, but I learned that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that stay still, like a car in a parking lot or a neighbor who refuses to open his door. My mother continued to be friends with the Vietnamese couple at the market, but there was always a lingering sadness when we walked past the back of that barn. We no longer just saw an old building, we saw the place where a mystery had ended in the most horrific way possible. The small town atmosphere, which usually felt like a warm blanket, started to feel a bit thinner after those murders. People began to lock their doors more carefully, and the local pastor's church saw a lot of empty pews for a long time. It was a loss of innocence for all of us. I grew up understanding that human nature is a complex thing, capable of great kindness like the couple at the store, but also capable of extreme cruelty and even worse, indifference. I still think about that woman in the laundry room sometimes. I think about the courage it took for her to stay silent under those clothes and the absolute betrayal she must have felt when the pastor's lights stayed off and his door stayed locked. It's a reminder that being a good person isn't about the title you hold or the clothes you wear. It's about what you do when someone is screaming for help on your doorstep in the middle of the night. Living in that train depot gave me a unique perspective on life. I saw people coming and going, even if it was just in my imagination, but the real stories were the ones that happened right there on our street. The bloated man in the trunk and the sounds of that night down the street became part of the town's hidden history. They are the stories that aren't written in the official records, but are whispered by the locals who remember the smell of the air and the sound of the silence that follows a tragedy. My childhood was shaped by these moments of stark reality, teaching me that the world is a place of both light and shadow, and often they are separated by nothing more than a thin wooden door or a pile of laundry. As I got older and eventually moved away from that converted train depot, those memories followed me. They served as a foundation for understanding the importance of community and the devastating impact of its failure. The image of the Vietnamese couple, me and her husband, remains a bright spot in those dark stories. They were the ones who noticed something was wrong, who spoke up and who tried to keep their neighborhood safe. They represented the best of our town, while the events around them represented the worst. The train depot is probably still there, and the barn market might still be serving customers. But the town is different now. The people involved have moved on or passed away, but the echoes of those nights still linger for those of us who were there. It taught me to pay attention to the things that seem out of place. A strange car, a quiet neighbor, or a smell that shouldn't be there. It taught me that life is fragile and that our safety is often dependent on the choices of those around us. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to have a mother who kept me close and friends who looked out for one another, even when the world outside was turning into something we couldn't quite understand. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.